is one lovely sounding indicator. Oh, does this mean I'm into ASMR now? This car's like the worst thing that's ever happened to me. Sick! And that is actually the best thing about this car. Strap in, people, we're going into a D-segment hybrid. Okay, so the other day I dropped Mrs. N off at the train station in this. She was off to see the Lady Boys of Bangkok. That's not important.
I don't find them attractive, it's just confusing.
Anyways, no sooner had she stepped out of the car that someone knocked on the window and asked if I would take a fare. And it was at that moment that I realised that this is the most depressing car I've driven all year. Actually, that's not quite true. I kind of knew it from the moment that I sat in it, really. But when I pulled away, things got much, much worse. Because not only is this a Ford Mondeo, it's a Ford Mondeo Hybrid. That's like affliction on top of listlessness. Like Sam Smith doing a cover album of Sinead O'Connor's greatest hit.
Since you've been gone, I can do whatever I want.
So what's the matter with it then? God, where do I start? Leaving the drivetrain aside for a bit, but we'll definitely come back to it. Just to be in this car is to understand exactly why people started abandoning this sort of stuff and buying SUV-shaped cars instead. It feels all low and cramped. I mean, it's not cramped, there's enough headroom, but it just feels that way, you know? And the dashboard is so thick that you feel like you're sat in the middle of what is a very long car, so it's really hard to judge where the front is. It just feels long and clumsy. In other words, it's kind of big, but without that feeling of spaciousness that you get from an SUV type car, or the visibility. And then there's the design in general. It's just all horrible and grey and bland and plasticky. The centre console looks like a crap stereo that you bought from Curry's one time. And the screen's really small and it's really slow to respond, and some of the build quality just feels way off. Pour exemple, in my particular car, the panel gap here between the dashboard and the door card is unacceptably wide, but it's positively razor thin compared to the gaping wizard sleeve on the other side, the driver's side. In a modern car, that is just rubbish. Now, some of this would be excusable if this was fun to drive, but it's not. It's horrible. There might be a decent chassis under here somewhere, and I'm sure there is, but it's so far buried beneath the horror of this hybrid drivetrain that all traces of it have disappeared completely, right? So for a start, there's the fact that Okay, let's chill, let's roll back a bit. Look at this sensibly. I am, of course, a responsible car journalist after all, not an angry consumer. It's a hybrid, right? And hybrids mean cost calculation benefits. Surely, that alone is going to pull this car back into the realms of rationality. Well, you think so, but indeed, its WLTP, fuel economy and CO2 ratings are 47.9, I hope. Yes, and 103 grams per kilometre of CO2 at best. It depends on the size of wheel that you get. Those figures hardly mean it's going to become Greta's next company car, right? It's just 10 quid cheaper per year in VED than an equivalently carbony petrol car. And yeah, you might save a few hundred quid a year in company car tax compared to a diesel of similar power and price, but at what cost to your mental health? I probably am going a bit overboard here, like, sorry Ford. It's just really exciting when you get a bad car. The drivetrain, right, it's like Ford has gone to Toyota and asked if they've got any first-gen Prius hybrid drivetrains kicking about that they didn't use back in the early 2000s, and then just shoehorned them into this car. We'll come to how they've done that in a minute. Excuse me French, but it is absolute mad. Asking this to accelerate is like asking Kevin Patterson to wash the car.
£5 we agreed, and £5 it is. That is so unfair! Take it or leave it. All right!
The main thing you get is that classic manifestation of the Cvt Gearbox, which just gives you this horrible, constant drone if you're doing anything other than really gently feathering the throttle. Hang on, I'll let you hear this. Now you'll notice that I was accelerating for some time there, and that's because this thing is so slow that there was never really any risk of us breaking the speed limit. In theory, this drivetrain will allow the car to move using just the battery and the electric motor, but it never actually happens. And the reason that you will very rarely get the battery working by itself is because, relatively speaking, it is absolutely tiny. So its main and de facto only job is just helping the petrol engine along and allowing it to cut out when you're coasting. So you will find when you're on the motorway that you lift off the throttle and it will tell you that it's using the battery, but what's actually happening is it's just turned the engine off. Now, in fairness, Ford has managed to engineer a very smooth transition between the electric motor and the engine, and you can't tell when either is cutting in or out. And that's something that Ford says it's improved specifically as compared to the last Mondeo Hybrid, the pre-facelift one. Oh yeah, so this is a facelifted Mondeo and they've tweaked the hybrid a bit, but as regards differences, anyways, that bit, the hybrid thing, is a little bit better than before, and the fact remains that if you are just going along really gently, either at town speed or at 70 on the motorway, this is very refined, in the sense that the engine's ticking over quietly, and generally the Mondeo is a fairly refined car. They've got that bit of it sorted out. Ultimately, in those circumstances, it's a lot more refined than the diesel Mondeo that you're probably thinking about getting before considering this one. The problem is that when you're not driving like an octogenarian with clinical anxiety, this is about as pleasant as being an octogenarian with clinical anxiety. The added weight of the hybrid system, the battery and the electric motor, basically, means that Ford has very obviously had to stiffen the suspension. And so now that generally emollient quality that the Mondeo has always had and that Ford is pretty famous for with the Focus and the Fiesta as well, has largely gone, and this rides pretty much like a hot hatch, but without any of the associated driving lulls or power. And it feels bloody heavy too, right? Not just because of the suspension, but because when you're at motorway speed, for example, it always feels like you're having to give it more than you should be just to keep it ticking over. It feels like it wants to scrub off speed, you know? It just doesn't feel comfortable with itself somehow. Now, the reason this battery won't keep the car going by itself for any speed or length of time is because in the pantheon of electric car batteries, it is minuscule. And yet open the boot, right, and you would think that it would be packing enough energy to power Boris Johnson's Facebook spam bots for like a decade. The way Ford has packaged the hybrid part of this car by basically shoving it in the boot is comical by modern standards. And it's the reason why this massive long Ford has a smaller boot capacity than the Toyota Corolla Estate, a car that is arguably one or even two classes down from this. And speaking of the Corolla Estate, very recently our Dan drove that and he really liked it. And not in a this is quite good for a hybrid sort of a way, but in a genuine this is a good car sort of way.
But I'm going to cut to the chase today and just come out with it and say this is a brilliant car. And I have no hesitation in recommending it to anyone in the market for a mid-sized family estate that focuses on comfort, practicality and low running costs.
And that means the Corolla Hybrid is cheaper, more practical and more betterer in every single way than this, which renders this car pointless really unless you are ideologically really engaged with the idea of having choice. I'm not even finished with the things that are irritating about this car, right? So the dynamic stuff. The Mondeo's got a fairly well-established reputation for being decent to drive. But driving this, you wouldn't necessarily understand that, right? So it does change direction quickly enough, but it's kind of numb at the wheels at the same time. Plus the brakes are dead spongy. They're better than they were before. They were kind of grabby in the pre-facelift one. But there's a lot of pedal travel before they start actually doing anything. Kind of gone the other way. And then there's just little things. So the speedometer, for example, it shows you speed in 20 miles per hour increments, but what it's actually showing you is 20, 40 and 60, when arguably the three main speeds that you need to know in the UK are 30, take two. Main speeds that you need to know arguably in the UK are 30, 50 and 70. It's not a big thing, it's not a safety problem, you can still see how fast you're going obviously, but in the context of this car, it's just that little bit more irritating. Okay, so I feel like I should roll back a bit here again. Clearly, I hate this car, but I also think I've let the script run away with me a little bit. There are some people who are going to understand this car, who possibly might even enjoy this car, and who are going to want to buy it for whatever reason. I'm not solipsistic enough to think that my opinion is the only one that counts. Who? Though. Well, that's just it really. I cannot see any rational person driving the Corolla Hybrid Estate and this side by side and then picking this one. And that really is the choice that you have, because although there are other hybrid estates, They're all bigger, posher, more expensive than these two. And so, however you feel about this, you end up drawing a slightly terrifying conclusion. Well, not actually terrifying, but in our little car bubble, terrifying. And that is, when it comes to reasonably practical and reasonably priced hybrids, then your best bet is the good old SUV shape. So the Mitsubishi Outlander Phev is getting on a bit now, but it is much bigger and much more practical than this, and it is a lot more economical. It's a plug-in, that's why, but it is. And that means it's much more tax-friendly if you're a company car driver. Or you could look at the much nicer, much more modern, and much more Korean Kia Niro hybrid. I know, depressing, right? But if it makes you feel any better, somehow, Ford seems to agree. Because rumour has it that this is going to be the last D-segment hatchback saloon estate Mondeo that ever will be. Because Ford is planning on turning it into... that's right, a crossover. There's just no escaping it now. So in conclusion, there is no reason that I can see for this car to be a thing you can buy. So there you go. I don't necessarily think I'm telling Ford anything it doesn't already know, really, deep down inside its corporate bowels. But also I think this might be the last Ford that I get to drive for a while. Oh well, see ya, I'm out. Done. We are like totally flooded here. Check this out. Oh well, I'm having some fun at least. Oh, bloody hell. I'm a bit worried I might actually sink at some point. I might have to go on the motorway instead. Oh dear. Bloody hell. Welcome to the north. Usable if it was good to drive, but it's not. It's horrible. Oh God. And it does feel bloody heavy too, and especially on the motorway, right? So when you're ticking along at 70... who, though? Puddle! Yes! Boy, that is a lot of water. Now, another reason why I wish I was in an SUV right now.